or share it with your colleagues, you'll definitely have that ability. Zoltan, thank you for that wonderful introduction for both me and Vicki. We are going to look at our agenda, and I'm going to let Vicki share with you today what we're going to cover, and then we'll get into the content of our presentation.
All right. Well, thank you, James, and Zoltan. Thank you so much and also Zoltan for that kind, brief introduction. If I'd known James was giving his whole bio, I would have added a bit more.
Come on, Vicki, you should know that. I'm never going to shy away from that.
But it's wonderful to join all of you, and I have to say it's been a real pleasure for me to work with James and also Amy Rising and the rest of the design team. So I will walk us through our agenda for today, and then James will get into the nitty gritty. So just a little bit of background on the development of the CalTPA. We'll talk a bit about the pilot study, get into more detail regarding cycle 1 and cycle 2, and then the actual supports for the pilot itself. And we hope that you will sign up, if you haven't already, to be part of the pilot. Next slide, please. Continue on. Okay, so here we have the timeline. You can see we started this work way back in the fall of 2016. I happen to be part of the credential work group when we were talking about designing the TPEs, the teaching performance expectations for the new preliminary education specialist credentials. As you know, we went from 7 credentials to 5 credentials. So CTC approved the new credential structure in February 2018, and then also affirmed subject matter requirements, TPEs, program standards, and authorization statements in April 2019. Then we began our work as a design team in February 2020. I can't believe it's been almost a year that the design team has been coming together. I think, James, correct me, we only had one face-to-face meeting, and then correct. Everything else has been online. And I have to say, given all the challenges with being online, it's gone extremely well. I want to give a shout out to James and Amy for their careful attention to working with the design team and making it, and I don't want to say painless as possible, but it has been a very enjoyable, but very thoughtful, very, very thoughtful process. And you will see that the design team is going to continue through June of 2022. So we signed on for a 2-year, at least 2.5 year dedication to designing the CalTPA. So again, from my perspective, I'm very appreciative of the thoughtfulness that has gone into the various stages of designing the CalTPA. And we're now getting into the pilot testing of cycle 1 and cycle 2, which will continue through April of this year. Then next year, we're going to start, or starting in the fall, we'll start with the field testing part of it. You can see that there are lots of different elements to making sure that the CalTPA is reliable and valid. So from a statistical design standpoint, every I and every T has been dotted and crossed as we go through this. Then there'll be a standard setting study in May of 2022. And then the first year will be in 2022 through 2023. And the commission will then adopt the new passing standard in August of 2022. So we've done a lot of work already, obviously. We're excited to be in the pilot testing phase with this, and we're looking forward to actually having the CalTPA in place with regard to 2022. Any questions about the timeline?
Vicki, may I add something?
Sure.
Just to let you know, we've been able to stay with our proposed timeline, even with the pandemic putting us into online format. But please understand, this is simply a working calendar. It all depends on what the commission decides in terms of looking at the samples from the pilot testing and also the field testing to determine what actually happens. Just as a reminder, we always are making recommendations to the commission, but it is the commission that is making the final determination of how it's administered, what is administered, and how this will take place. Also, Remember that this is the California model, that is the CTC sponsored model. The Ed TPA also has a special ed model, but they of course would have to go through the same process to become a sanctioned performance assessment that would be used by the commission.
Yeah, thank you, James, for clarifying that. I'm sure there will be some questions by some of the participants regarding the Ed TPA and the CalTPA and so forth. So thank you for addressing that. But both performance assessments will have to be approved by the commission. And certainly the same teaching performance expectations have to be included in both performance assessments. So thank you, James, for clarifying that.
Sure.
Next slide, please. So here you can see the design team members. It's a wonderful group who've been very dedicated to participating in the design of the CalTPA. And you can see that we have representatives from universities, university programs, as well as district folks. We have some representation from county offices, as well as the California Department of Education. So it really does reflect, I believe, a broad spectrum of stakeholders related to the performance assessment perspective. So it's, again, very thoughtful. We have representatives of the 5 credential areas that are participating as well, high incidence, low incidence, and so forth. So it's been a wonderful group to work with. Next slide, please.
And then also, we also have a parent representative, which
yes,
is one of the first
yes,
that we've had on one of our design teams, which is really exciting. She was part of the CDE Advisory Council. So we're very, very happy to have a parent representative on the committee as well.
Very good.
Okay, so now it's going to come to what I'm going to explain, which is looking at the 2 instructional cycles. The first instructional cycle is very similar to the Gen Ed CalTPA, which focuses on learning about students and planning instruction. We are currently in the process of assessing Cycle 1 pilot study. I actually had to leave that meeting to come over here and present with you, as well as Vicki, because we are in the throes of starting to assess initial pilot results. And it's always exciting to see that. And then instructional cycle 2, again, like the Gen Ed, is focused on assessment-driven instruction. But in cycle 2, it will be credential specific. So the mild to moderate support needs will have a set of expectations around what is considered appropriate for assessment. Or extensive support needs, the same, visual impairment. So each credential specific area will be able to look at how it explores assessment in the classroom or in terms of an itinerant assignment for the purposes of looking at what assessment data is gathered and what moves forward in terms of how that affects planning. One thing you are going to notice is that the same cycle is followed in the CalTPA. We always start with plan, where the bulk of our work begins. As educators, we know how important planning is in delivering instruction to students based on content standards and a very rich and rigorous approach to learning. Then there's the teach and assess step, where classroom teachers will actually present the material in front of the students, record themselves, and look at their work through annotations, and then come down to reflect, where they will reflect on their lesson and the goals that were made to determine what indicators of student success have happened. And then they will move to apply, where they will apply their new knowledge to future lessons. One thing I want to point out is you'll notice that this is very similar to the general education CalTPA. I do want to add, though, as we get into the key design features, there are very unique aspects to the Education Specialist program. But as Vicki will share with you, when the new teaching performance expectations were designed, we have that common trunk of the universal teaching expectations, which reside in Gen Ed, to allow for the least restrictive environment for students, and always that continuous incorporation of content-rich instruction that all students in California deserve, and that what the IEP in place can support to help that students have the same access that their general education peers have. So I just want to explain that when the design team was grappling with this, this was something that was very important. And nothing was lifted part and parcel from gen ed to ed specialists, but the cycle remained the same because the design team agreed that the 4 steps were important in approaching work with students. So if we look at the key design features, just like with gen ed, we have a focus on all students, including students who are English learners, also students with academic, physical, and/or behavioral goal needs, and other undeserved students that candidates would need to take a very close look at to ensure that the social and emotional well-being of those students is supported. It is important to note that all of these are in line with the authorization statements for the credential and the ed specialist programs. Focus on asset-based content-specific pedagogy, and it will be in either literacy or mathematics. Of course, we know that integrated content can exist within these, but the design team felt that a focus on literacy for one cycle and mathematics for the other was the approach that would encourage the most often seen IEP goals that students would possibly have on their individual education plans. Following with diagnostic formative feedback to candidates and programs is always so important. They complete cycle 1, receive feedback before moving on to cycle 2. It is centrally scored by assessors with the requisite education specialist credential. As Vicki said, there were 7, now there's 5. So we're having to map out to make sure that we do have the appropriate credential. But for example, I am specifically working with the visually impaired assessors, and both have credentials and/or strong pedagogical knowledge of working with students who are visually impaired. Video of teaching practice is specific, annotated, and direct. That leads into what we always want, and that is the natural harvest of evidence. Nothing is added onto, but instead supports what is already taking place in candidates' classrooms. Some more important information: educational technology is embedded into instructional practice, as well as assistive technology, where those find their places to help support students' access to curriculum. There is choice built in cycle 1, where candidates can either write their response in the apply section or they can video record. As we said, integrated instruction within literacy and mathematics. But the big one that was very much a part of what the design team wanted to see was the facilitation of instructional support personnel in planning and the lesson and/or activities. If you look at the teaching performance expectations for the education specialist credential, collaboration with adults and other important individuals who support the learning of students is everywhere in the TPEs. And so the design team felt that candidates needed to show how do they facilitate not just necessarily paraprofessionals, but behaviorists, counselors, general education teachers into the support that students have when they are in these various classrooms. We have a focus on academic language and/or communication development. Remember that one of the areas is early childhood special education. So in some regards, there is communication development with these younger children, and also depending on the level of the disability with other students. Also a focus on age and/or developmentally appropriate higher order thinking. And as I said, with the formative nature, doing one cycle before moving on to the next. Zoltan, just to do a check, are there any questions coming through in the chat that Vicki or I need to address?
Not yet, but feel free to add them if there are any.
Okay, so what I'm going to do is turn it back to Vicki to really look at what are we assessing in the Ed Specialist CalTPA. I believe you're on mute.
And I believe this is still your section, James.
So through inquiry, we have the instructional cycles that do determine the ability for a candidate to plan, teach and assess, reflect and apply. In cycle 1, they work with one group of students to plan one lesson, determine 3 focus students, as was outlined earlier, reflect on practice, and then also apply new knowledge. And then, as I said before, in cycle 2, working with one group of students, they will engage in classroom-based assessments. We're getting away from the formalized assessments such as the Brigance or the Woodcock-Johnson 4, and really looking at what is taking place in the classroom in terms of maybe a small learning group, possibly even working individually, or again with a whole class, a co-teaching or co-facilitation model. But how are they looking at those classroom-based assessments, incorporating educational technology to conduct reteaching or extension of the content? So, Tan, did we get a question or a comment? I saw the
Enrique is asking, so the focus students are somewhat similar to the Gen Ed. Enrique, I believe the Gen Ed CalTPA, is that what you're referring to? Okay.
Yes.
Yes, Enrique, they are. The only difference is that all the students would have an IEP in addition to these other designations. So what, if we think about the English learner, what is the capacity for the candidate to not only work with a language learner, but also one that is receiving special education services and understanding the importance of providing that scaffolded and specific structured planning to help not just the language needs, but also the needs of the IEP. Vicki, did you want to add to that? I just want to make sure I'm getting that correct.
No, that's fine, James. I thought no, that's very clear. Thank you.
Right. And then Vicki and I have had some conversations around goals in the IEP, also accommodations such as on LPAC. Again, very important considerations for candidates who are pursuing their credential in these areas.
I think I saw another question in the chat.
Yes, there is one. What is the thoughts about candidate working on a dual credential? Could a candidate use Cycle 1 from Gen Ed and Cycle 2 from Ed Specialist?
Well, thank you for that question. And actually, that was one of the agenda items for our last design team meeting. And because we know that the field is very interested in the development of dual credentials. We're still discussing that in terms of the number of cycles and so forth, but we're keeping the candidate really at the center of that conversation because we don't want to, have additional challenges or hoops for the candidate to go through. We want to be very thoughtful about that because we really do want to encourage programs to develop dual credentials. And as you can imagine, there's a lot of variety as to what a dual credential could look like, whether we're talking about general ed and say mild to moderate support needs, or maybe mild to moderate support needs and extensive support needs. So there's different variations of what a dual credential program can look like. So we're still discussing what the cycles will be. And then of course that will definitely go to the commission for final approval. So stay tuned on that. We know that everybody is very interested in understanding what that's going to look like. Thank you for that question.
And we have a request to explain the requirements for Focus Student 2.
Okay, so with Focus Student 2 right now, and it's in development, we remember that once we receive pilot data, we will then come back to the design team and work will begin on possibly revising and or expanding what different focus students may be. But right now, the candidate will choose a student with an IEP or an IFSP if it's early childhood, and we'll really focus on looking at the academic, behavioral, and or physical learning goals that the student has in the IEP to really take a look at diving deep into what the needs of what assets that student possesses, what do they bring to really focus on that asset-based instruction, and then what other learning needs the candidates have. I will tell you that in terms of our initial review of Focus Student 2 in the assessments from the pilot study, rightfully so, many of the candidates are choosing students who are on the autism spectrum. I think that that is an excellent piece for them to really explore, is looking at a student who has been diagnosed with autism and how that supports different levels of approaches in terms of meeting the needs of that child.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I do anticipate that there will be quite a bit of conversation about focus student number 2. Again, as James mentioned, we're gathering a lot of information from the pilot that will help us possibly in clarifying the various focus students. So stay tuned on that. I know that, again, from the field's perspective, we certainly want to know kind of what to expect. But it is a work in progress, and again, a very thoughtful work in progress with taking a look at the data from the pilot to see what changes should be made. And then, of course, we'll have the field study. So we're really just hitting more or less the highlights so that you understand the framework that is being followed, but there will be more information being provided with more specificity as we go along. Okay, shall we go to the next slide?
I think so. So now we're at the teaching performance expectations.
Right.
Yes.
So this is definitely the basis for the development of the CalTPA. We're all very familiar with these various teaching performance expectations of engaging and supporting all students in learning, effective environments for learning, organizing subject matter for student understanding, designing learning experiences for all students, assessing students for learning, and then TPE number 6, developing as a professional educator. And as James mentioned, and I think we're all aware that we have the universal teaching performance expectations, which I think is really a blessing on one hand, that we're bringing together the general ed expectations along with the foundation for the ed specialist teaching performance expectations. And then there will be the specific teaching performance expectations for the various credential areas, so that the teaching performance assessment is comprehensive in that way to make sure that the various sets of TPEs are reflected. And they're being looked at very rigorously and making sure that the rubrics that are part of the teaching performance expectation clearly address these teaching performance expectations. So just to remind you that on the CTC website, if you Google or put in special education, you're going to see the document that has all the teaching performance expectations there for your information. Next slide, please. So underlying theory of action. So what really is the more or less the conceptual framework, if you will, that underlies the teaching performance assessment? And universal design for learning, I would say that that was one of the priority areas that the design team was very clear about. If you're more familiar with the general ed teaching performance expectation, you know that universal design for learning is also a key part of that, but it really is a major focus for the current teaching performance assessment that is being piloted at this point. So UDL is very critical, and I would say really a foundational concept for the teaching performance assessment. Making sure that as our candidates are designing their lessons, that they are based on asset-based instructional design, and that we are incorporating funds of knowledge for the students in our schools. So from a very positive perspective, and really reflecting and acknowledging what students come to school with in terms of their funds of knowledge. Looking at the role of English language development in lesson or activity planning and delivery, absolutely a very critical element for the expectations. As James already mentioned, that candidates are to have a deep understanding of age and or developmentally appropriate higher order thinking skills, And then again, as James was mentioning, in terms of academic language development or communication development, certainly for some of our students who are nonverbal, to look at multiple ways of supporting students in terms of developing communication. Also, you'll see when you get a chance to look at the pilot, to be able to acknowledge augmentative and additional communication devices. AAC is also a critical part of this for some of our students with more extensive support needs. The use and the facilitation of instructional support personnel, again, whether it's paraprofessionals, other educators as well. So how are our candidates utilizing that kind of instructional support? Modeling and metacognition and scaffolding. So this is really the basis, I would say, in terms of the design for the teaching performance assessment. James, I think you're on next.
I am. So to look at the pilot study, I just wanted to show you which programs participated in the Cycle 1 pilot study. We were excited to have these programs have their candidates go through Cycle 1. They went through the entire parts 1 through 4 of Cycle 1. And then we received these counts. So you can see how many of our programs participated, which was 13, 3 of which were Cal States, 3 of which were lead educational agencies, and then 7 were privates. We had a total number of 171 candidates who registered, and then these are our counts for the completed submissions. You'll notice that MMSN and ESN are our largest, because if you look at the distribution of credentials in California, the data from the commission, I would say almost 95% of all education specialist credentials are in the area of mild to moderate support needs, as well as extensive. That's the former mod severe, which we're now calling extensive support. We had 4 candidates, 4 submissions for early childhood and 7 for visual impairments. To take a look a little bit at the timeline, it began back in October. We are now, we're in terms of where the launched, the submissions were due on New Year's Eve, December 31st. Scoring has begun, so we are here in January. And then what will happen next month, which really is in a few days, is that the aggregated results will be reported to the programs. They will not receive individual score reports. They will instead, programs will get aggregated score reporting. So that's what happens in the pilot. We give the aggregated scores rather than individuals. So looking ahead to Cycle 2, we're excited that we're going to have approximately 400 candidates. And you can see the distribution. 5 Cal States are participating, 4 LEAs, 12 private institutions, and now we're adding a UC. A UC is going to participate in the Cycle 2. As of right now, we've only had our private institutions with coming forward to confirm. And then we also have, in terms of our candidates to date, 20 have signed up, but the deadline to confirm is on Monday. But that possibly would be extended to ensure that we do have the counts correct. You'll probably notice that there's been a significant jump from Cycle 1 to Cycle 2. A lot of that has to do with student placements in the spring as opposed to the fall. In addition, many programs who had originally signed up for Cycle 1 had to pull out for Cycle 1 because they didn't have the placements with their partnering districts due to the COVID pandemic. And so they're having a little bit more of success in placing candidates in the spring. One thing I do want to add too is that we are going to pilot study Cycle 1 again with the visual impairment and early childhood. We are going to cycle that again. And then also we are going to have DHH pilot Cycle 1, and that will be at Cal State Fresno. So now we wanted to look at Instructional Cycle 1, and I'm going to turn this back to Vicki to take a look at Cycle 1, and then I will talk about Cycle 2.
Actually, James, I think you were doing both of these.
Okay, I'm doing both of these. So looking at the assessment structure, again, we talked a little bit about this, but this gives it to you in a little bit of a better visual. Candidates would get to know students and provide their instructional context. This is very important based on the placement of the candidate. Remember that we do have a large number of interns who are also pursuing their education specialist credential. And so for many of them, it is the placement that they have due to their job. So again, are you working in a co-teaching model, a co-facilitation model? Do you work with small learning groups? Are you an itinerant teacher? Do you work one-on-one? What is your instructional context? Because then it helps determine the selection of the focus students. And as we said, all students who are selected must have an IFSP or IEP, and they are going to be in the areas of English learner, students who are receiving specific targeted academic, behavioral, or physical support services, and then students with outside factors that might affect performance. And as you know from the general ed CalTPA, that can be a whole host of different reasons that candidates could choose from. They then plan their lesson and provide their instructional rationale. And key to this is the facilitation of instructional support personnel. How different folks who are coming into the room or possibly even supporting the students, how you are utilizing those resources to help in the planning and execution of your lessons. Then, of course, there's the teach and assess, the video recording with the annotations. There is one specific annotation on part 2, which focuses on the facilitation of instructional support personnel, because again, getting away from what we may have seen, unfortunately, in classrooms in the past, where an aide sits at the back of the room, grades papers, or makes copies. It is now really about involving paraprofessionals and other support personnel to ensure that students have access to all the services to reach those content-specific learning goals. A reflection, of course, and then also an application of new knowledge. Then as we go to cycle 2, you'll probably see similar pieces here, which is looking at the planning and determining those instruments that will be used to determine how a student is reaching certain assessment benchmarks. We know that progress monitoring is so important in an education specialist classroom, and it is the hope of the design team that this process will help candidates understand what they bring to an IEP meeting, not just the formalized assessments that are done, but what's going on in the classroom. Because as we know, families, guardians want to know how their children are reaching their IEP goals, what data do you have to support that? And so this progress monitoring was really a focus in cycle 2. Also, the use of educational technology and the facilitation of instructional support personnel. Reflection involves the analysis of the assessment results to then inform the application of new knowledge, either in reteaching what was not yet mastered by the students, or students that mastered the concept and performed well at a certain benchmark would then extend the activity to provide for continuation of learning on the content standard. Before I get into systems and supports, Zoltan, I just wanted to check in with you to see if there were any questions or comments that Vicki or I could address.
Not as of yet, but keep remembering to put that into the chat if you have questions that come up.
Perfect, thank you. So systems and supports for the pilot, the first thing I wanted to show you is our pilot website. And if you could, Zoltan, if you're able to place this web address into the chat. The materials are here, and we invite anyone to look at them, see what is being placed in front of the candidates. The Cycle 2 materials for the mild to moderate and extensive support needs have not yet been posted, but they will be there soon in mid-February. So this is the pilot site that is being used. And so on that site, as I said, for faculty, the assessment materials are there, a draft of the program guide that is being used for programs participating in the pilot, acceptable supports, and then also candidate responses. But again, the candidate responses that we have right now are the Gen Ed CalTPA models. We will not be putting any models yet for the ed specialists until we become operational. As you know, right now, it is not a requirement for the education specialist credential to complete a TPA. That does not occur until 2022. So we are not going to place any models up until we are in the operational year, because it could very well be that the design team makes some revisions and we have a performance assessment that's not yet been formally adopted by the commission. For candidates, tips on preparing video files, guides for using the pilot system, links to the frameworks for the California Department of Ed, and then also the CTC program standards and performance expectations. Zoltan, I saw that the chat lit up. Is there anything that came forward to us?
That was me putting the address in.
Oh, perfect. Thank you. So as you know, there is a program guide for Gen Ed. We're also in the process of developing one for the ed specialist faculty to use, as well as the candidates. And remember that the audiences are these different individuals, the deans and department chairs of organizations, the superintendents, assistant superintendents. We're in a very unique position because, like I said, many of the candidates who will be completing the Education CalTPA will be interns, meaning they are the teacher of record. And so as such, we really address this to the districts in which they are working, coordinators, instructors, the folks who serve as field supervisors, the master teachers, and then anyone else who supports candidates.
James, thank you so much for mentioning that. I think it's incredibly important for those of us at the various programs to share this information with this group. I think that's been one of the challenges in the past, from what I hear from some of my colleagues, not specifically about the CalTPA, but that some, especially our part-time faculty, our course instructors, don't always know about what is expected for the candidates related to performance assessment. So I would just reinforce what you're saying here, that we should share this as widely as possible. Thank you.
Absolutely. And to that point, Vicki, the program guide is always expanding as we come, to terms with things that we did not anticipated. Our glossary is expanding, as well as the information that we wish to share with the candidates and their institutions where they are securing their credential. So just some initial other additional supports. We do have office hours for the Ed Specialist CalTPA programs, but of course we are an open door. We welcome anyone to drop in. They are Fridays at 10 a.m. And so we, if you are in a pilot, or if there's information you would just like to further explore, we would invite you to join us there. Again, right now we have the CalTPA virtual think tanks, but we are really thinking about next year expanding and using our virtual think tanks to maybe spend 30 minutes with Gen Ed and do 30 minutes with Ed Specialists. And then in some cases, we really want to start bringing them together and talking about what things can look like for co-teaching models, co-facilitation models, really bringing them together, because this is so important, as Vicki mentioned, having the universal teaching performance expectations as a trunk for especially the mild to moderate or extensive support. And then of course we have our online resources, our YouTube channel, and now there is an Ed Specialist CalTPA playlist, and so the bit.ly is there. Before I turn it back to any questions or comments, we just want to really thank you for letting us share this information with you. Vicki and I have been at it from ground zero. Actually, Vicki has been even before with the work on the redevelopment of the TPEs and the program standards. So it's just so exciting to see the work move forward, and really seeing candidate submissions come in and everything that we can do. Because I want to quote Vicki before, just that this is a long time coming, and it is so great that we now have this, this work forward to really meet the needs of our children who need it the most. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and just have us go into gallery mode. And Zoltan, if there's any questions, please let us know, and Vicki or I would be happy to address them.
Kelly just made a comment. Would you like to speak about your comment, Kelly?
I'm just appreciative of the fact that there is the goal to bring things out of silos and to bring things together for the benefit of our candidates, but also just to bring the whole team together more on performance assessment. And it's nice when that's not just being worked on from inside trying to chip away at it, but that by design, that's the intent. Thank you.
Right. And thank you for that, Kelly, because really that's what we hope is that continuum of development, both in teacher, but also what we have with administrator, so that we do have, the expectations may be slightly different, but in terms of the development of an educator from where that candidate chooses to go, it does remain at a continuous continuum rather than, like you say, be siloed and almost become a sort of unwritten rules of expectations that you have to figure out. That's really what we're trying to get away from.
And I'd just like to make a comment too, and it's something that I've heard Amy and James mention in this work, that actually the performance assessment can actually drive the field forward. And I think for those of us in our field, we're very concerned that our students, our TK or even, well, obviously TK through 22 be in an inclusive setting as much as possible. And that we think that through the performance assessment, we're going to be moving the field forward with supports, obviously. So I've been very pleased to hear that. And so it's not the status quo, it really is moving the field forward with all intents and purposes. So I think that's a good thing.
They might need some tow trucks to move them around, but hopefully we will get them there.
So I'd love to hear who all is on the call. How many of you, just raise your hand if you're at either district or university preparation programs? Okay, and the rest of you, are you district people? Okay. So primarily, I would say university programs or district intern programs. Great. Okay, terrific. Wonderful. So I'll put in a plug for Cal Council in March, which you'll also be hearing from the CTC consultants, again, about all the various activities going on with the commission and also on the CalTPA as well. So look for that. It'll be March 3rd, 4th, March 4th, 5th, and 6th, we hope. Definitely the 4th and 5th, and possibly the 6th. Lisa, what is this, the induction program?
I'm just gathering information just with the executive order this year, recognizing how much our induction program didn't understand about TPAs and RICAs, and just wanting to be in the beginning stages of understanding what's coming to our program in the future. So thank you.
Right. And Lisa, just to remind, education specialists don't have a TPA right now. Hopefully we will not still be granting executive orders by 2022, although I'm hoping, I hope, but yes, I think the structure is the same. So I agree, knowing what's there, but then also understanding as induction programs, one of the key pieces that is in all of our program standards is that development of that induction development plan, and candidates using what they've learned from their CalTPA experiences to help inform the writing of those plans.
And in just moving forward, just trying to help our programs understand how to bridge that gap, so we're not being so redundant,
Mhm.
and how we can build upon what's already occurring in the prep program. So all this information is very helpful. Thank you.
Very good. Well, thank you for being here. Okay, any other questions or comments? Okay, Zoltan, if you'd like to
Yeah, thank you so much
be the
for
man with the
joining.
plan.
Thank you so much for joining. We really appreciate this participation. I'm new to this work, and the thing I keep remembering is that we are doing great things for our students in California. So thank you for everything you're doing. And anything else, James?
No, just hope everyone has a wonderful weekend. I think it's going to be dry tomorrow, so I'm hoping that we can enjoy the weekend. So everyone just stay safe and have a wonderful time with your family, and just enjoy these days.
All right. Be
Bye,
well,
everyone.
everybody.
Bye. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.